There we go. Okay. Good morning to everyone. And now we have Facebook too. Good morning to everyone, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. I am in a different location in my History Matters New Haven base. I'm on a different floor because I'm trying to get closer to the server so that, like last time, you don't lose me in the middle of the session. So we have a lot to talk about today, but before I start talking about it, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is also at a remote location, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody, live from Pittsburgh. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be with you, even when we're on the road. We love being with y'all every Friday. So here's how this works. If this is your first time joining us, Joanne's going to talk about today's topic for about 30 minutes. You can continue to engage in the chat, add links, have fun. But if you have questions about today's topic, we would love for you to put those down below in the Q&A. I'll be back in about 30 minutes and we'll have a little discussion. See you in a few minutes.
Wonderful. So, I, as ever, as every week, pondered what to talk about. And this week, my prevailing feeling before I began to have this inner conversation was anger. And then I realized that what I'm angry about in part is some of what we learned this week that allegedly happened because we're in the middle of uncovering things. And also just the ongoing lack of accountability, seemingly for anything, because when you think you have no accountability for anything, you do whatever the heck you want. So I want to talk about accountability. I want to talk about specifically, and I will say I always check. I believe we talked about accountability roughly a year ago. I didn't go back to see how the conversation went, but I can promise you it did not go however this morning's conversation is going to go. At any rate, the two things this week that certainly got my attention, and I'm guessing most of you as well, were on the one hand, the new report that came out from the Senate about Brett Kavanaugh and about the investigation for his appointment to the Supreme Court, and the fact that seemingly, and this is be a little complicated, and I'm going to offer you what I found out so far. And again, since it's unfolding, I allow, we'll see where this lands. But at any rate, supposedly, the White House under Trump kept very tight restrictions on what the investigation could look at, who the investigation could interview, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and explicitly did not, the FBI did not, and it's in part, this is all the White House, look at, they got, I think, over 4,500 tips from outside about Kavanaugh, none of which were considered. So in a lot of ways, this was a very, I saw when I was researching this online this morning, someone said slow walked. I don't know, fast walked. I would say slow walked investigation, fast walked appointment. There was a lot that wasn't investigated. There were very tight restrictions. And according to what I can see from how the FBI so far has commented on this, the procedures are that they follow the instructions that they're given. And in the case of things like tips from outside, there are no procedures. So when the people who represent Trump say, well, we follow the normal procedures, and the FBI says, well, we follow the normal procedures, formally speaking, that's true. The FBI listened to what the president said. The president set restrictions, but like I suppose you could say didn't violate rules, or at least I don't believe they did. So everyone can say, oh no, this is normal. But the FBI also is saying now, but what's normal is that we don't go beyond what we're told to do. And we don't take account of that. And we were told not to look at certain things, so we didn't look at certain things. So at any rate, the point here is at the time, all kinds of questions about Kavanaugh. And at the time, former President Trump was saying that the investigation had free reign and that they could look at and interview anyone, and that is not the case. So here we have one thing in which the desire was to have Brett Kavanaugh be on the Supreme Court, And so things were arranged so that that would happen as readily as it could possibly be made to happen. That's not how this process is supposed to work. You're actually supposed to really, at least to some degree, investigate who the candidate is so that you get the best person on the court. Now, obviously, historically speaking, you don't always get the best person on the court, but the idea of, really curtailing an investigation to that degree. And again, my theme here is doing things like that in part because you assume there will be no accountability. That matters. The other story that appears to have exploded roughly in this last week is that towards the beginning of the pandemic, former President Trump sent a COVID testing machine to Putin. And he did this at a point when Americans didn't really have access. I don't want to say newly designed because I don't have the dates, the timeline, but it was not like a normal test. We're not talking about little swabs and the things that you and I do to test for COVID. It was a machine, and it was something that was not widely accessible. And the idea was that if you had something like that here, you could test people for COVID in a more effective way, and people wouldn't be meandering around with COVID, spreading it everywhere. But instead, the not so available machine was sent by Trump to Putin. And again, seemingly no accountability. They're coming up now because everyone is, the election's coming and people are suddenly like, wait, what? Huh? Did we? And then there's Woodward, coming out with this information at a very late date. There are a lot of things we could talk about here that have to do with information and elections and accountability. But the one I want to focus on is people doing things when they assume that they're not going to be held accountable, and what has happened in the past along these lines. And the one example that I thought of when I first thought of this topic, I think will be interesting. I don't know if it's instructive. We'll decide that as I speak and as we go through the Q&A. Okay, so accountability, before I jump back into the past, as a reminder, right, there are a certain thing to a functioning democratic government. And the rule of law is one that everybody, generally speaking, has the same law applied to them, that people aren't above the law. And of course, we can all point to all kinds of ways in which the rule of law is biased as it is applied. But the goal, the opportunity, the legal meaning of it, the rule of law applies to all. That's pretty central. Free and fair elections, also pretty central to a functioning democratic government. Basically, the idea being that we, the people, give people power, give presidents and other power for those positions that are set up that way. Obviously, we do not install every political appointee into office, but generally speaking, we, the people, have power over the president, over senators, over representatives, over local government. That's the point. The point is that you have free and fair contests in which Americans have the right to vote, American citizens. We register what we want, and then the result of the election, which registers who wants what the most, that's how an election is determined, right? So basically, we the people govern, and the majority college, but still, the idea is generally being that the majority has the say, not that the minority is eliminated, but free and fair elections, the rule of law. And then the third, or a third thing that's essential to democracy is accountability, meaning, yes, we give people power. They are accountable to us for how they use that power. We don't give people power and assume they can go on to become dictators or czars or whatever else and apply the power however they choose. It's not the way things are supposed to work. That's part of why the founding generation was so terrified of demagogues. Demagogues in their mind were people who were going to pander to the public to get power of some kind, promising the public everything. What's the saying? Bread and circuses, and then get that power and do whatever the heck they wanted to do with that power. That's a danger in this kind of government. And accountability, it's why it's so important. The idea is if we bestow the power, because it's a gift from us, the people, the power holders are responsible. So I've said this before, and many others have as well. We live in an age that is in a crisis of accountability because it appears that so many things that should be held accountable, even on the most minimal level, don't appear to be. And you can think, back to January 6th and before. And when you're talking about specifically people with power, so there are Americans who have been tried and for what they did, and the rule of law applies to them. But does the rule of law apply to people higher up for what they have done? And not even just a president, but members of Congress. People with power should be held accountable for what they do. We're not seeing that demonstrated in a really great way. Again, this is not a new phenomenon, but particularly now when so many norms are being violated, and so many rules are being bent to the level of distortion in the times that we're in, when democracy itself is on the table in this election. Not having accountability is pretty dire, and to the extent that we see that now. And the two things that I mentioned before, sending a hard to get machine to Putin in the middle of a crisis and basically favoring him over Americans who would have been served by having Americans know earlier if they had COVID, and installing into the Supreme Court through tight restrictions, whatever you want to happen in the Supreme Court, and sort of assuming there's no accountability for what you did. So, it's okay. And I'll pretend like we're having a broad investigation, and life will be good because I won't be held accountable. That's a problem. That is not democracy really functioning. Now, this is, of course, not the first time that people with political power did things that broke the law, even, and assumed that they would not be held accountable for that because they had power. And that they assumed as power holders they can do whatever the heck they want. And who's going to hold them accountable? The example that struck me when I first began thinking about this topic, and I know it won't be surprising, but stay with me, was the practice of dueling in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The reason that explicitly applies so well is that dueling was illegal, generally speaking. And again, it's on a state by state basis, but it was pretty much illegal everywhere. The difference often between the states was the punishment. Some states had very lenient punishment, some states really had strict punishment. But related to what we're talking about now, most politicians, most power holding people who they were dueling, and although they were breaking the law, they were not held accountable for breaking the law. And this happened in a variety of different ways. It happened because sheriffs didn't want to hold the elite accountable. They didn't want to follow through and hold them accountable for what they did. It happened because even though the elite were shooting at each other, they joined in doing practices that would make it easier for them to avoid the law. So in the case of the Burr-Hamilton duel, which I know best, um, and I know I've talked about this before, people had their back to the dueling ground as it was happening, so that if it went to trial and they had to testify about what they saw, they could say, I didn't see anything. I just heard some gunshots, or the guns were kept in a bag or sack, so that if they were asked, did you see dueling pistols? They could say, no, I saw no guns at all. And as feeble as this sounds, what it meant was that they were helping each other evade the law when it came to dueling. And indeed, generally speaking, they were not held accountable, to the point that after the Burr-Hamilton duel and Burr flees and goes into exile, there were a number of Jeffersonian Republican members of Congress. This is not a Jefferson's advice, this is them acting on their own, but they wrote a petition, which they sent to the governor of New Jersey. And the petition basically said, I don't have it in front of me here, but it basically said, why are you going after Burr for fighting a duel? Like, why are you thinking that he did something bad? Why did he have to flee? Why is he being considered for murder or for sending a challenge in New Jersey and or New York? Like, why are you doing this? We all know that elite people like him, aren't charged with breaking the law when it comes to dueling. And I wish I had the language in front of me, and I do not. But the petition basically said, this is unfair. We don't do this to power holders. They get to do what they want. Why are you picking on Burr? Which is a kind of a remarkable thing for Congress to say to a governor, but that's how blatant this was, right? So that duelists were dueling and they were taking precautions, but they also assumed it was a thing they could do that they could get away with because they would not be held accountable for it, partly because other elite people holding power sometimes did it as well. And so no one wanted any accountability for this until, at this point, the vice president of the United States was being brought up on charges in New York and New Jersey and had to flee. And then suddenly, you know, this is something that is being pursued. It's being pursued to a degree that things aren't normally pursued. And then people actually have to say point blank, I didn't mean that to be a pun, but there are a lot of gun metaphors in the English language. People had to say, we don't do this. We don't charge people like Burr with this crime. So people dueled, assuming, generally speaking, as particularly at the end of the 18th century, there wouldn't really be accountability for it. If they did what they were supposed to do, they didn't use the word challenge, they didn't keep the challenge after the duel, they turned their backs, all of the little practices and rituals intended to help them evade the law. Now, what's interesting is after Hamilton is killed and people are actually now paying attention, the vice president killed the former leader of the Federalist Party, got attention. So suddenly, in a sweeping way, people are paying attention to the practice of dueling in a way that had not been true before. And people who opposed dueling, because there was an anti-dueling movement, they had something they could hang their hat on. They could say, this is a travesty. Let's end dueling now. They didn't succeed, but they tried. Sometimes some historical accounts suggest Hamilton died and dueling ended in America, and no. But people who opposed dueling did step forward, and there are pamphlets, any number of pamphlets written at the time, arguing on now is the moment we can end dueling. And what was the way in which they thought the best way to end dueling would be? 4 words. Don't vote for duelists. Again and again and again and again. What they said in these pamphlets was, we don't like dueling. It's not right. It's breaking the law. They're breaking the law. You want to know how to end this? Don't vote for duelists. If they duel, if they have dueled, don't vote for them. Don't give them power. And although they didn't use the word accountability, that's in essence what they were saying. Hold them accountable. They do it. You don't like it. The way you hold them accountable is by not voting for them. There you go. Free and fair elections, helping instill accountability. So that was the assumption. Now, again, did dueling end? No. And I actually haven't gone. Here's another, every once in a while on History Matters, we talk and I think, oh, that would be a really interesting topic of someone to write a paper on. Was there a change in, and this would be really roundabout to try and research, but when all of these pamphlets were coming out and people were saying, don't vote for duelists, I have no idea if that actually had an impact on people voting for duelists. And that would be hard to research in part because most people didn't necessarily advertise the fact that they were dueling. So that sort of gums things up. But at any rate, I don't know if these anti-dueling people saying don't vote for them actually had an impact. The fact of the matter is, the elite people were, I suppose you could say, a little more cautious. Dueling became less common over time. That did happen. But there were still, Andrew Jackson was a known duelist and he was elected president. So this did not end dueling and it did not end giving power to people who did this practice. But the fact that that link was made, we're talking 1805, 1804 when the duel happened, 1805 when the pamphlets are coming out, even 1806, I can think of some pamphlets, that the way that what they wanted to do at that moment, what they were thinking about was accountability, and holding back votes is a pretty concrete way of holding politicians accountable. That's very logical. That's very direct. That wasn't necessarily the norm. So the second thing that came to mind for me, thinking about this topic, preparing for this episode, was 1856, the year that Charles Sumner was caned on the Senate floor. He's an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts. He gave a really, really powerful anti-slavery speech in the Senate. And a South Carolina representative, Preston Brooks, came to the Senate and beat him to the ground viciously for what he said. And of course, that's actually dueling culture. You don't duel with someone you consider to be beneath you, you cane them. And that's what was happening in this case, was not only was Brooks making a point about, how dare you say that, but he was doing it in a way reserved for inferiors. So there's like an extra added bonus insult to the beating. At any rate, that was honor culture stuff. And that was a moment, again, we're getting close to the Civil War in that moment. In my most recent book, I talk about the string of violent incidents, one after another on the national stage between politicians. And again, bound up in the caning of Sumner ends up being the most prominent one for a number of different reasons that I won't go into, but there's a lot of violence. And at about that time, there was a California congressman named Philemon Herbert. There are some names that are so wonderfully 19th century. There are other names that are wonderfully 18th century. Philemon Herbert, a representative, I believe, from California. So Philemon Herbert went to the Willard Hotel, my favorite hotel in Washington, I will admit, because of the history that happened there. Goes to that hotel, goes to the dining room in the Willard Hotel. It's late. It's like, I don't know, 11 o'clock in the morning. I think it actually is. That was the time. Shows up in the restaurant slash dining room and asks for breakfast and is told by the waiter, I'm sorry, sir, but we're past the hour when we serve breakfast. I can't serve you breakfast. So Herbert gets angry. Herbert begins to demand, because, I mean, he's a member of Congress, that breakfast gets served for him. And the waiter holds firm. I'm sorry, sir, but we can't do this. Now, ultimately, voices get raised. Herbert gets enraged. Other people who work at that restaurant start coming over because something bad is going on. Um, Herbert pulls his gun because, of course, members of Congress walked around with guns. The waiter begins, he's like holding up a chair because there's a gun and there's a little bit of chaos in the dining room. And I remember when I was researching this, I found people saying, actually, I did find someone saying, well, dining room, but I thought, oh, normal hijinks, which tells you about this time period. But at any rate, in the end, what happens is that Herbert kills the waiter, shoots him dead in the restaurant at the Willard Hotel for not serving him breakfast past the hour. Pretty blatant. So ultimately, Herbert is actually brought to trial. But when he goes to trial, he is surrounded by a cluster of members of Congress. Not saying anything, they're just there with him. Hi, we're a group of important people. We're going to go to the court and be here with the other important person who is being potentially held responsible for a murder. And he is not charged with murder. I actually cannot remember. He's charged a fine, I think, which is certainly not what happens when you shoot someone dead in open view with a room full of witnesses. It works, right? And Herbert is essentially not held accountable for what he did. He's an important person. Important people don't get held accountable. In his case, unlike dueling, he didn't have that moment when he thought, you know what, I could murder this guy and I won't be held accountable. Or at least he didn't consciously do that, but that's what happened. And that was prevailing. That was widespread. There's a silly anecdote that I remember uncovering that there was a member of Congress picking flowers on the Capitol grounds. And a Capitol police officer went over to him and said, I'm sorry, sir, but you're not allowed to pick flowers on the Capitol grounds. And the member of Congress says, I'm a member of Congress and I can do whatever I want, and begins wildly picking flowers to prove He's not held accountable for things, right? He's an important person. He isn't held accountable. Now, that's a norm. That's not an old norm. We can track it across time that people who are politically important, who have a lot of money, generally speaking, escape a certain degree of accountability. Uh, but when that gets mixed in with the functioning of a democratic politics, when that gets mixed in with the nature and constitution in every sense of the word of the Supreme Court, when that gets mixed in with a president's handling of a deadly plague, and it's suddenly not so much, I'm an important guy so I can pick flowers, or I'm an important guy so I can duel with no consequences. I'm an important guy so I can stand in a violent crowd and may not be violent. And the people who are here who are being violent standing outside the Capitol might be held responsible, but I won't be. This goes beyond that. Is sort of crossing the line into the public realm of politics. So it's like thumbing your nose at the public to do these things, except that it isn't even that because when the machine is being sent to Russia, when the investigation of Kavanaugh is being held in, restrained, these people aren't thumbing their nose at the public. They're not thinking about the public at all. They're thinking about what they want and who they want to please. And they can do that because they assume there will not be accountability. Now, we've talked before about the difference between, laws and standards and rules and norms. And one of the things I've said before is that, and I remember saying this very early on when Trump became president, excuse me, I said it to Brian Ballow in the history department at UVA. And whenever I say things like this, somehow some part of me assumes, well, probably more senior historians wouldn't agree with this, that this is going to sound naive. And I said to Brian Ballow, I never understood before how, I didn't use this word, let me use a better word, how weak norms were and the degree to which they can just be violated and a huge level of governance can be affected with norms. Norms, it's just an agreement, an informal agreement. Well, this is how we normally do things, so let's keep doing it this way. And then someone says, yeah, no, I don't want to. And then, no guardrail. I said this to Brian Ballow, and Brian Ballow said, I totally agree. There's a difference between intellectually knowing something and feeling it in your gut. And we live in the age of feeling in our guts things that we intellectually knew, but had not necessarily lived through to this severe and extreme a way. So, again, the idea that important people aren't held accountable for things is hardly a new idea. We could go all the way back in time in American history. But the idea that people do that, that it finds its way into the purview of formal government, and that there's clearly an assumption, doesn't matter, right? We can do what we want, get away with it. And having all of that happen at a moment when democracy itself is on the line. We've had all kinds of crises before. We will have them again. No two crises are the same. And this holds true for political crises as well as many others. And the thing, or one thing, that makes our moment of crisis distinctive is the simple fact that one of the major parties in power no longer follows democratic norms and standards. They're just willing to push them aside. That's this is a that makes this distinctive. That makes things that happened at other moments in time different from how they're unfolding now. And accountability, bolstering democracy, being assumed to have no application to people who, in many ways, are using democracy as it suits them. I know it's harsh terms, but I'm just going to lay that out there. That makes this time distinctive. So at any rate, accountability, we live in a time where in so many ways there's no accountability. But this last week, those two things, those two discoveries really are like slapping us in the face. It's like, in if people did this and they didn't, take out a glove and sort of slap each other, across the face. I challenge you to a duel, which is not how it worked. If it did, we feels as though we're sort of in one of those moments, like I'm so not accountable that I'm going to do this thing, and I'm going to continue running for president. And even now, people will not hold me accountable for what I did. They never do. They do not hold me accountable. And I want to be your president. Accountability matters. It matters in democracy. It matters in any democratic government. It should matter here. And I suppose this is my plea. I'm 4 minutes over. It should matter here. And some of the power of accountability comes from us. Elections are ways to enforce accountability, as my pamphlet writers in 1804 and 1805 well knew. And as we come towards an election, it's important that we realize that power matters. The fact that we as citizens have a vote matters. What we do with that vote matters, perhaps in ways that we're not used to thinking about. Okay. Um, I am here is the thing about land of mugs. Last night, as I was preparing for this, I went into the mug cabinet here in New Haven, and I do not have a wide supply of mugs that I could find that applied to this. But luckily for me, there was one that applied. We're just going to kind of violate a norm because I don't think this has ever happened before, but this suits. I'm still with Mr. Grumpy because I was beyond angry. I have been beyond angry and beyond grumpy even, uh, just processing just in the last few days what's been exposed. So I'm repeating a mug from one week to the next. That's right. I have violated a norm. If I thought of it that way, I would have framed it that way. I
Maybe
am.
we can get Mr. Grumpy to sponsor History Matters, be like our corporate sponsor.
Ooh, it's true. So it is, I see people saying Rabbi Beth. It is an appropriate mug. I wish I'd thought to say that I'm violating a norm in the conversation where I'm talking about violating a norm. But regardless, it suits. It suits my mood this week. It suits our topic. Okay.
Good one. All right, I am opening the Q&A. All right, our good friend Sydney, our favorite student, undergrad down there in Georgia, says, how is accountability of presidents and politicians in general different now, and how do you think it will be going forward?
How is accountability different now and how will it be going forward? Well, good question. Part of an answer is there are at least some people pointing out, although nothing is happening, that members of Congress who may have been involved in January 6th may have been, do not appear to be being held accountable in any way, or at least investigated, or nothing. Um, so people are talking about that because it's a dramatic event, and the idea that some members of Congress perhaps were involved, we do not know. Um, right now, we're at a moment where accountability or a lack of accountability, at least, is visible. In the same way that it made me angry, I'm not alone. It's happening everywhere. So part of the way in which accountability comes to matter is when people notice and highlight it. It's how in another totally different subject, totally different context, but we've talked before about how marginalized groups can use founding documents and laws passed by people, white men, and marginalized groups can say, yeah, you know what? You said this applies to the United States of America, and I'm an American, but you're not applying it to me. Interesting. Aren't you accountable for saying that, I deserve this, I'm an American, and if I don't deserve it, are you saying that all Americans don't get this? Like, how do you, so this idea that if you give a law or you assert a norm or you do something, put it out as a founding document, and people can come along and say, yeah, that's a great norm. That's great that American citizens have that. I'm one. Look at me expose the fact that you're not doing that. It's a form of accountability. It's a way of using accountability, and in a powerful way, because, right, founding documents and principles and precepts are supposed to have a deep power and emotional power. People, Americans are supposed to say, well, that's what makes us American. So if someone steps forward and says, oh, as I think it's Harriet, is it Harriet Tubman? Ain't I an American? Ain't I a woman? I take it back. Ain't I a woman was Harriet Tubman. But the same idea, actually, I stand with it. Ain't I an American? Right? All kinds of people of all kinds throughout American history, in poetry, in oratory, making that statement, making that comment. Guess what? I'm holding you accountable for what you say we have because you're denying it to me. So that's longstanding. This moment, there are such blatant violations, almost sometimes with glee. Like, look what we can do. This is what we do. We're getting away with it. Look at us. This shows how important we are. The positive side of that, if you can say there's a positive side, is that people notice. And it can cross lines in the eyes of people who assume some degree of this always happens. So to me, this moment stands out for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is some of what's going on now is an extreme, extreme version. Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?" Thank you, Gloria. I knew as I said it, I did not have the facts. Um, my apology. At any rate, at this particular moment, I thought of Langston Hughes too. Look at the History Matters people. I was indeed thinking of things, and then I stopped myself because I knew, as with Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, I was going to make a mistake and be sad. At any rate, the fact is, at this moment, things are so blatant, at so extreme, and people are so in our face with the assumption that it doesn't matter if they can kill someone on Fifth Avenue. Doesn't matter. Um, it's hard to overlook that. What impact will that have? I do not know. How will that affect the future? I do not know. I've said this before. I think anyone who is sitting here in this moment and pretends to know with any confidence precisely where we're going, how we're going to get there, or what happens once they're there, they're lying. No one knows. Really, no one knows. It's a really interesting time to be a political historian. But anyway, that's my roundabout way of answering that question.
We've got more questions. So our longtime friend Daniel Bromovich is with us. He says on Kavanaugh, didn't we know that they restricted the investigation? It's just that they didn't follow up and interview anyone. We knew that. Is this new thing now just making it official?
Well, so I could not, excuse me, before this, read the report and everything that it says. I think generally people assumed that something was not right with that investigation. And in part, it had to do with the allegations people had against him and the way in which they appeared to be just not followed through on. As I understand it, and I suppose in part it's making it formal, but as I understand it, we now have like official statements about what was allowed to be followed through on and what was not. Now, I did read this morning that the actual emails between the White House and the FBI, they have not been made available to the people doing the investigating. So they do not have that in front of them. But we now have statements from the White House and from the FBI, and the FBI statements make it clear that they're saying basically, we did what we were told. That's the way we've always operated. And outside of that, we didn't challenge anything. And the 4,500 people who piped up on the hotline and said, we actually have something to say and were ignored. That wouldn't necessarily change things, but at least it should have been considered. That falls outside of the realm of what we normally do. There are things in which, here's our normal procedure. The tip line in some way or another, again, I suppose is more of a norm and not so much of a standard. And so when people can say we did what we normally do, and on the one hand be correct, and on the other hand be guilty of actually not pursuing an investigation in the full way that they could. So you're right. I don't think the idea that something was fishy about that investigation is new. I think the fact that we're now actually boiling down the degree to which things were being reined in. I think that's part of what's going on right now with that particular topic.
Uh, okay, our good friend Dave always asks great questions. Today he's asking, how do you think Ford pardoning Nixon led us to Trump avoiding accountability? What role have Republicans in the Senate aided and abetted this?
Wow. Well, I mean, that does get into the question of presidential pardons, right? Which is an interesting topic all by itself. And this question is wonderful because it raises that very important implication is that if someone does something really bad, and then the president says, you will not be held accountable for this. On the one hand, everyone says, ah, yes, now we can return to normalcy because the country won't be divided and we're putting this behind us and moving forward. Okay, but what it also means is that we just haven't reckoned with what just happened in a way. Um, it's just going to sit there. And the fact that anytime a crisis happens on a level, that kind of crisis happens where something happens and people are like, uh-oh, they attach gate after it, right? Something gate, pizza gate. The fact that that now is our shorthand for a crime of a certain kind shows the impact of what Watergate had and the fact that it just sits there as a crime that existed and nothing really happened because of it except the immediate impact it had on the people that were involved in it. So yeah, I do think that that has an impact. How you treat a crisis at one moment absolutely shapes what you think you're going to be held accountable for in the future. And that is one of the arguments against presidential pardons. The argument of putting all of the strife behind us and so pardoning someone is attractive, right? Because you're as we are now, you're really tired of focusing on the crisis, and you're really tired of the degree to which things feel unstable, and you really don't want to make things worse and you really want the nation to get past it. So that's attractive. It's not SCOTUS Brogate, Annie. um, but anyway, pardons are attractive for a whole bunch of reasons. But there's a downside.
Yeah,
And this
Romy Fluck had a similar question about echoes of Nixon not being held accountable. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
combining those, but I want to give Romy a shout out for putting a good question in there as
Yes.
well. Um, okay, so Freda is another good friend of ours. We have like so many of our regular community members with us today. I always love seeing them. Freda asks, how do you use your vote to express extreme displeasure with the action of a government candidate as part of when you object more strongly to their opponent?
Wait, repeat the question.
How do you use your vote to express extreme displeasure with the actions of a government candidate when it's part of your objection is more strongly to their opponent?
Ah, right. Good, good, good question. So if you're holding your vote back from a duelist, you might be actually electing the opponent.
First, like less
Uh,
of two evils, my grandma used to say.
right, the lesser of two evils, but it can still be pretty evil. Yeah, so I made that wonderful proclamation, and this is an important question because it actually highlights the fact that there's no easy answer and that this isn't necessarily one that you can't say, I will never vote for a duelist because maybe the duelist is the person who actually has upstanding political values, but also, could say, well, as a private citizen, I duel. So you're right that that is not an absolute rule. The idea, though, that our votes are power and that what we do with them matters is important. It's important. And I think it's easily forgotten. I also think voting is not the only way that you show what you think. Now, it is true, and this began happening. Actually, I'm not going to be able to say the precise year, but in the semi-recent past, members of Congress stopped having town halls because they were being like asked questions and held responsible for things and they didn't like it. Uh, Accountability from their constituents. And so that became less common, which for this very reason infuriated the heck out of me. It was like, but of course you're supposed to like deal with your constituents and be responsible for what you did. Um, again, crisis of accountability, that normally is a way in which you can express what you're thinking, is have a town hall, stand up in front of a public audience and say something about someone and force them to respond. And sometimes that can be an accountability moment. Sometimes that's right, skipping debates. There are all kinds of ways in which you can be held accountable and you can avoid being held accountable. So yeah, I think that's an important addition here, which is you can't simply say, I will not vote for duelists, because you actually have to think about the candidates. But if you actually say and make it clear, like way before the election, if people are clear on the fact that they don't support duelists holding office in a general way, if they're serious about that, if they make that very clear, if they're loud with it, on the one hand, you'll get politicians lying, like as far as dueling, there might be politicians who are like, me, I never duel. But if you make it very clear that that actually is a standard that matters, I mean, however people are violating norms and standards, public opinion still matters in a democratic republic. Public opinion still matters here. And you know that because people run scared when something comes out. People with power run scared if something's going to come out that's going to make them look bad, right? And they worry like boycotts can still matter, right? Holding people accountable. Let me turn off my phone. Um, that there are all kinds of ways in which you can hold people accountable publicly that are not necessarily just bound up with voting. And I think those matter too. Public accountability. This was part of what Alexander Hamilton said in The Federalist when he was talking about the presidency and why there should be a single national executive, not a council, not a group. He said the problem with a council of executives, because people argued that would be good. We shouldn't give all the power to one man. We should spread it in a council. And that way there's ways of fighting back against wrongdoing. And Hamilton said, well, there's a big problem with that. Let's say you have a council of three people and they are the executive, and one of them does something wrong. He will hide behind the other two. There will be no accountability. A council enables people to hide what they're doing. Now, of course, the second half of Hamilton's argument, which is if you have a single president, he will be held responsible for what he does and he will feel shame. I'm sorry. We live in an age where shame is in short supply too. But still, the argument was people need to be able to be held publicly accountable and that that's supposed to hold people back from venturing too far out. I think there is still truth to that, despite the fact that it's wounded, that sentiment is wounded right now.
Right. Our good friend Linda Kraus, hi Linda, asks, what effect do you think it has that Merrick Garland was so slow to attempt to hold the former president accountable? And do you think there are repercussions of Biden choosing him as the attorney general?
Well, before I made a pronouncement on him, I would want to do more reading. I will say that one of the many ways in which not holding people accountable or not holding people accountable quickly enough matters really is what the Department of Justice does, is what justices do, is what the legal system does, is what the Supreme Court does. All of those are more formal ways of holding people accountable. And so, yes, if there's something that needs to be dealt with and it's slow walked, the dealing with it, so that it appears that maybe it won't be dealt with at all, that matters. Now, I am not an expert on the normal speed with which things happen, with what's happening behind the scenes. So I hold back on making pronouncements because if you go back and look at the conversations people have been having over how quickly or slowly things are happening, that's part of the conversation is, yeah, but behind the scenes is dot, 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 dot. So at any rate, I think it matters, but I'm not going to make a pronouncement on specifically how it matters because I would want more information before I did that. I see here Dale says, look at that. Heather's letter for yesterday covers the idea of the media holding people in power accountable, spurred on by the Atlantic endorsing Harris. That's precisely I didn't talk about the press, but that's precisely it, right? That public forms of media can hold people accountable by an endorsement and by stating why they're endorsing someone. We like this person. We will never like this person, and here's why. So that is another form of accountability. That's the media actually asserting itself, hopefully with concrete reasoning and information, in a way that the media's legacy about what's going on right now, let's say just say it's complicated, and often problematic, but that having the media step in and say, well, here's what we think. It's just our opinion, the editors say, but that's a form of accountability. It's very public, couldn't be more public if it's in a form of the press. That's a good point.
Right. Scott asks, what does it seem that the exposure of egregious behavior often happens right around election time?
Yeah. So that's right. And so part of it, again, I'm not making any declaration against anybody, but this kind of stuff, the accountability stuff, it takes energy, it takes motivation. You have to have hope that it's actually going to have an impact. And as you're burbling along normally, those things are going to be in lesser supply than they become when suddenly there's an exit door or an entrance door in view, which is the election. So it certainly makes sense that close to an election, suddenly things that people have been like, yeah, I don't like that. Suddenly people say, wait a minute, there's something happening out in the hallway here, and I don't know what it is, just in case you're hearing the noise that I'm hearing. Just banging. At any rate, yeah, that there it's logical because now there is a moment. It's actually an example of accountability mattering, right? That suddenly there's an election coming, which means people could actually be held accountable for what they did. So suddenly people start focusing on it more than they did before. It makes sense. On the other hand, can easily have the appearance of we're going to do anything we can to stop this person, so we're going to scramble around and find things. Um, People can claim that, right? You're inventing crimes. You're trying to prevent this happening. It's why it becomes important with these kind of, actually the October surprise is called a surprise for a reason. It's why it's important when you're doing things specifically in October that you have evidence, that it's justifiable, that you're doing it for a good reason, that it doesn't look like scrambling around, desperately throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks. That's the first accusation, right? Look at those, in this case, look at the Democrats scrambling, trying to find something, interrogating former President Trump in a way he doesn't deserve. Well, the energy being given to that now makes sense, but it looks like, oh no, they're looking for things. The fact is, these things have been sitting there for a while, but the energy to drive this kind of investigation is pretty extreme right now.
All right. Our good friend Dale asks, what are grounds for impeaching a Supreme Court justice? Are they different than the grounds for the president or members of Congress?
You have to repeat that one too.
Dale is asking the grounds for impeaching a Supreme Court justice. Is it the same or different than a president or member of Congress?
Well, I mean, impeachment is a little different wherever, whatever branch, whoever you're trying to impeach, there are differences, not just in procedure, but in standards, in the likelihood that people get impeached or not. Um, I can't like work my way, impeachment form versus impeachment form versus impeachment form and tell you that specifically. But I can say, obviously, that becomes complicated if you're talking about a Supreme Court justice, which is a lifetime appointment, and which it then becomes, if you're going to be impeached, it darn well better be for something that stands. And there's have been times in American history when, people don't want to step forward and do something because it's such an extreme gesture. For, Yet that's the very reason why people should act, because someone with a lifetime appointment should actually be held really responsible. I saw someone, and I missed it in the comment streaming by, I saw someone talk about ethics standards in the Supreme Court. This is partly bound up with that too, right? Denying that there should be any ethics standards in the Supreme Court is quite a statement. And having those standards is another form of accountability. If there's a standard that people should do X, Y, and Z, and you can point and say, guess what? We agreed that this was pretty unethical. And look at so and so doing it right now. Just that simple fact has a power, the power of exposure and accountability. So I guess what I love about the questions that you're asking is they're raising an important point, which is that accountability could take many forms. And it doesn't only rest with the vote, but the vote is a really specific way of holding people accountable. But you're absolutely right that the press can hold people accountable, that the public can hold people accountable in ways besides with their votes, that boycotts, demonstrations, protests, all of these things, if they're done intelligently and they're done in a way that will get attention and make a statement, that they can all be forms of accountability. And wherever we are politically, that still matters. There are a lot of us, the people. We do have power as the people. We forget that. We live in our own world, and we forget that if a big number of people come together and say we are outraged at this in a way that is loud and has an impact and represents mighty numbers, that still matters.
We've still got so many good questions.
Oh gosh. Let's go for a
Okay.
little bit.
Okay, there's one here that I just love the wording of it. Candell Richmond. I'm not sure if you've been with us before, but I don't remember seeing your name in the chat. But Candell asked, is there a way to reset and return to established norms without codifying them? Or once they're broken, are they like an outstretched skirt that can never regain its shape? I just love that imagery.
Oh wow. I think you could bring the skirt to a tailor.
Called an amendment.
I,
Amendment tailors.
I think um I don't think once something is stretched out, it's gone. Um, I think it's not working. It's fallen off. But I think having rules and norms, well, not rules, having norms be violated could, again, depending on how people respond, can be a way of highlighting that fact. And maybe there's a rule that needs to be put in place of a norm, right? Maybe there's some kind of guardrail that needs to be put up to protect against this. So I think if you, this metaphor, I'm sorry, but it's really good. If you're standing there and your skirt falls off, because it's all stretched out, I know, then that certainly is a way of an extreme way of highlighting the fact that maybe there should be a guardrail of some kind. Maybe you need to do something so that that doesn't happen again. So as bad as the moment is, it can lead to change because it's public and it's bad and it's noticeable, and that's accountability. Actually, I saw Carol Lee said something earlier. I'm not going to be able to find it, but she says something about fact checking at debates in relation to accountability. That's a really good point. Because if you are going to take part in a debate and you do not want to be held accountable for what you say, which is what denying fact checking is, right? If you say, I don't want fact checking, what you're saying is, I want to be able to say whatever I want. And I don't want you to check and see if I'm telling the truth or not. That, I mean, in and of itself, it's a remarkable statement, right? You can't check me to see if I'm telling the truth. You can't check me to see if I'm lying. I don't like that. I don't want to be held accountable in real time for what I'm saying. That's what that says. That's an explicit statement that the person taking part in the debate does not want to be held responsible, accountable for what they're saying. Can't get more blatant than that in many ways. So yeah, that's what precisely fact checking. And I feel like we're still kind of in the Wild West era of how do you do fact checking and debating because we need it more than ever, particularly now. But it seems like every network and every debate it operates differently, and people are angry for different reasons. I don't think people have figured out the best way to do this. But what we are realizing, particularly because there's protest against it, is that fact checking matters. And that is indeed an attempt at accountability. And denying that it can be there is explicitly saying you do not want to be held accountable for your words. Think about that. I mean, just think about that statement. That's what it means. I don't want to be held accountable for what I say. I don't want you to tell me that I'm wrong. I can say whatever I want. You can't correct me. in real time for sure. That's just, every once in a while, the times that we live in, you lay something out really bluntly like that. And even though it's in front of us and we're swimming in this stuff all the time, you lay it out like that. I don't want to be fact checked means don't hold me accountable for my words. I want to say whatever I want. It sort of sets your head spinning on a certain level, right? The actual bare bones meaning of some of what we're seeing, even now, as we're sort of swimming in this mess, even now, even as a political historian, some part of me every once in a while is like, what? Like how how is that normal, right? It's not. But the fact that that is said so openly and freely, no, you can't check me. I want to say what I want. I want to be able to lie. Okay, there you go. That's what you are saying. I don't even know what to say to that. That pushes me back towards this face. That pushes me back towards. But yeah, and I will add one last thing, which I will add because I'm so interested in it. Technology complicates this too, right? Technology can be an accountability tool. And that's partly the press, that's partly our ability to communicate with each other, that's partly like social media. That's all the kinds of ways in which we can communicate widely, broadly, publicly, quickly. All of those things can affect accountability. It is noteworthy that at this particular moment in time, broadly, and specifically October, that some major tools of accountability, specifically Twitter, which could have been and sometimes served as a tool of accountability, are gone, are now no longer can function that way because you can't believe anything you see on Twitter. And um, I'm not a conspiracy minded person, but the fact that there are social media forums which increasingly appear to be uh, not reliable to an extreme degree like that, where you can't use it for accountability, you can't use it for effective communication, you can't use it to organize. That was one of the real powers of social media. When it first came in, the idea that like you could be lost in a park and you could go and go on social media or you could. I remember going to social media when something was happening in another country or in another state, and I could learn what was happening and I could learn what to do before the days when it became a Shark Tank. Social media, and particularly Twitter, were a powerful public tool. They were a public good in many ways, important. And I fretted for years when I began to see that maybe it wouldn't stick around forever. I panicked for years that when it left, it would take an important thing with it. And one of the things that it takes with it is accountability. Also, organization and the ability to effectively protest and to inform ourselves, but accountability too.
Yeah. The
So,
chat is lit.
wow. Well, I was going to say the chat. Yeah, I guess it is kind of. I suppose, okay, so here's what I say. I suppose we're moving towards after party time. It's 7 after. And I know I always say maybe we'll continue it next week, and then something happens, and I feel like I have to change topics.
He'll send us the questions in case. Yeah,
Yeah, send the questions, because in a way, the two things I spoke about, they like were revealed in recent days, and they have not fully blossomed, and it could indeed be, well, what am I saying? It's October, folks. This issue is going to continue to be pressing, and so we'll see we'll see what happens by next Friday. In which case, it might make sense to go back to the leftover questions and to keep this going. It's so important. It's so important. It's why I wanted to talk about it. Accountability, free and fair elections, and the rule of law. There it is, folks. Um, all of them, absolutely important. And accountability, in a way, is the most amorphous of them, right? The rule of law, legal system, free and fair elections, institutional accountability. So that becomes, I think, important to talk about. So, okay. Um, I know if only Musk had been allowed to back out of buying Twitter. Um, yeah, I'm not even going to go there, but Twitter going down, it was politically disastrous. And particularly now. Okay, so I'm gonna segue us to the after party. Let me explain what's going to happen now for folks who are here. Actually, I didn't say at the beginning, should have. You still have a few minutes to do it. If you are here for the first time, you can say so in chat and you will get a robust welcome because this is a real community and it's growing all the time, and we want to welcome you to the community. Um, but at any rate, for those who are new here, what's going to happen now is that we are going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on. We will continue to talk about whatever we want to talk about. We can be more freer and easier and more relaxed in our conversation in the after party. If you beamed in through NCHE, you can stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to go to the after party and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. In the meantime, as ever, I want to thank you for being here on a Friday morning to engage in the conversation of democracy, because that is what we do. And we don't even always talk about democracy, but today was a double whammy. We're having the conversation of democracy and we're talking about democracy. It matters. It matters because this should be happening all over the place. It matters because this general idea is a model of what other people can be doing. It matters because when we are here and we ask each other questions, we are going to be curious and are going to seek information and are going to spread questions and spread information, all of us, as we go off into our lives. We can spread democracy in that way, the simple questioning intelligently what's going on and thinking about what's actually happening. When you take what we do here and you bring it somewhere else, that actually can have a positive political impact. For all of those reasons, it really, really matters that we do this every week and have been. Oh, I even forgot I don't know what episode, maybe Carolee can tell us, 200 and something, something. Um, I totally forgot, but for 200 and something, something weeks, we have been doing this and 237. It matters. It profoundly matters. And I don't know about you, but I know me during the week, these conversations will come to mind, right? Oh, we talked about this, and here's kind of what people are thinking about it. I bet that happens for a lot of you. That that really matters. Information communication, democracy, right? That's what we're doing, information communication. So anyway, I'm not going to go on praising democracy. We love democracy, but it really matters. And thank you for engaging in this. Thank you to Annie and Claire and John and Jessica and NCHE for making this possible, as they ever have. I will see you next week and maybe with a new topic, maybe with a new version of this one. I have no idea. In the meantime, have a good week. Be safe. And for those of you who will not stick around for the after party, um, take care.